There are moments in a person's life that define everything that comes after them. Moments so quiet and so private that even years later, when you try to explain them to someone else, the words feel too small for what actually happened inside you. This is one of those stories. My story. And I want you to know, before I even begin, that what I am about to tell you is not something I rehearsed. I did not practice these words in front of a mirror, though ironically enough, mirrors play a very significant role in what happened to me. I am telling you this because I need someone to understand, and maybe, just maybe, someone out there is sitting in their room right now, feeling exactly the way I felt for most of my life, like there is something inside them that does not quite match the outside, like they are performing a version of themselves that was written by someone else, and they are so tired of reading from that script. I was born into a family that had very clear expectations. Not loud expectations, not aggressive ones, but the quiet kind, the kind that are woven into every small thing around you. The color of your bedroom walls. The toys left on the floor. The way relatives look at you and say things like, "He is going to be a strong boy one day," and everyone smiles and nods, and you smile too because you are 5 years old and you do not yet have the language to say that something about that sentence feels like a coat that is several sizes too large, and you are drowning inside it. Growing up, I watched. That was my primary skill. I watched everything. I watched the way my mother moved through the house in the early morning, wrapping a dupatta around herself with such ease, such unconscious grace, as if it was the most natural thing in the world, which of course it was for her. But for me it was like watching someone perform a magic trick I desperately wanted to learn but could never ask about. I watched my sister spend hours in front of the mirror, experimenting with kajal, adjusting her hair clips, trying on different earrings, and I felt something that I did not understand at the time, something that I told myself was just curiosity, just boredom, just the way any sibling would feel watching another sibling. But deep down, in a place I had learned very early to lock away and not visit too often, I knew it was something more. The first time it happened, I was 11 years old. Everyone had gone out. I cannot even remember where, some family gathering I had been allowed to skip because I told them I had homework. I was alone in the house for the first time in what felt like forever, and I remember the silence of it, how strange the house sounded without people filling it up with noise and movement and expectation. I wandered from room to room the way you do when you suddenly have freedom you do not quite know what to do with, and I ended up in my sister's room. I did not go in there with any plan. I want to make that clear. I was not thinking anything specific. I was just walking, just existing in the empty house, and her room was there and the door was open. Her dressing table was covered in the organized chaos of her things, little bottles and tubes and clips and scarves and bangles all arranged in a way that made perfect sense to her even though it looked like beautiful disorder to anyone else. I stood there in the doorway for a long time. Then I walked in. Then I sat down in front of her mirror. I do not know how to explain what happened next in a way that does not sound dramatic, but I'm going to try, because the truth of it is both simpler and more complicated than drama. I picked up one of her dupattas, a soft blue one with tiny embroidered flowers along the edge, and I draped it over my head the way I had seen her do 100 times, the way women in our family had done all my life, and I looked in the mirror. And for the first time in my 11 years of existing in the world, the person looking back at me did not feel like a stranger. That is the only way I know how to say it. The person in the mirror felt familiar. Not fully formed, not completely recognizable, but familiar in the way that a word you have been trying to remember suddenly comes back to you and you feel that rush of recognition. Yes, that is it, that is the word I was looking for. I stared at myself for a long time. Then I heard a car door slam outside and I ripped the dupatta off my head and put it back exactly as I had found it and ran to my room and sat at my desk with a textbook open in front of me, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure anyone who walked in would hear it. Nobody said anything. Nobody knew. And I spent the next several years pretending that afternoon had never happened. Here is what nobody tells you about the process of suppressing a part of yourself. It does not actually disappear. You can bury it under schoolwork and friendships and the performance of being what everyone expects you to be. You can pile so much normalcy on top of it that you sometimes genuinely forget it is there, but it does not go away. It waits. It is patient in a way that is almost unsettling, patient the way water is patient with stone, working at it slowly and steadily over years until one day you look down and realize the stone has changed shape entirely. My teenage years were performance. I was good at it. I played cricket with the neighborhood boys. I got into arguments about films and music with my cousins. I developed opinions about things boys my age were supposed to have opinions about. And I was genuinely good at some of those things, cricket especially, which was both a comfort and a strange sort of irony I only understood much later. Because being good at the performance did not make the performance any less exhausting. Every single day felt like I was wearing something heavy, not a physical weight, but the weight of constantly monitoring myself, constantly checking that the mask was sitting correctly, constantly adjusting and correcting and making sure nothing slipped. There were moments when things slipped anyway. Small things I hoped nobody noticed. The way I would linger a little too long when we passed a fabric shop and the silks and georgettes caught the light in the window. The way certain songs made me feel something I could not name, something connected to that afternoon in my sister's room, to that moment of looking in the mirror and seeing something familiar. The way I would sometimes watch old classic films and find myself drawn not to the heroes but to the way the heroines carried themselves, the particular way they used their hands when they spoke, the way they seemed to inhabit their own bodies with a completeness I had never felt in mine. College came, and with it came something unexpected. Distance. I got into a university in another city, and suddenly I was living in a hostel room with a roommate I barely knew, in a city where nobody knew anything about me, where I was not yet the person everyone had decided I was. And with that distance came something terrifying and wonderful in equal measure, the possibility of exploration. I did not do anything dramatic right away. I want you to understand that this was not a sudden revolution. It was more like a very slow thaw. Months passed before I did anything at all, and even then it was small things. I bought a magazine with a fashion section and kept it under my mattress. I spent a lot of time on the internet, reading forums and articles about gender identity, and then closing the browser window and sitting with my heart racing, and then going back and reading more. I began to develop a vocabulary for what I had been feeling all my life, and having words for something, I discovered, is one of the most profound experiences available to a human being. Because when you have a word for something, when you can name the shape of your experience, it stops being a formless anxiety and becomes something you can actually look at directly. The first time I bought something for myself, I spent 2 weeks working up to it. I had identified a small shop in a part of the city where nobody I knew ever went, a tiny place that sold women's accessories, nothing dramatic, just bangles and hair clips and small things. I went in on a Tuesday afternoon when the city felt quiet and slow. I was so nervous that when the shopkeeper asked me what I was looking for I almost said nothing and left, but I made myself stay and I said I was looking for bangles, and he showed me several, and I selected a set of pale green glass bangles that cost almost nothing, and I paid for them and walked out of the shop with them tucked into my bag, and I felt like I had just done something seismic, like the ground itself should have shifted to acknowledge it. Back in my room, with my roommate gone for the afternoon, I put them on. And I sat at my small desk and looked at my wrist with the bangles on it, and something inside me became quiet in a way it had not been quiet in a very long time. But I am getting ahead of myself. Because before I can tell you what came after, I need to tell you about the shame, because the shame is part of the story too, and leaving it out would make this a prettier story than the true one. Every moment of exploration was accompanied by its twin, which was the voice in my head that had inherited every cultural message about who I was supposed to be and who I was definitely not supposed to be. That voice was relentless. It used words like wrong and weird and broken. It reminded me of everything I stood to lose if anyone found out. It reminded me of the way people in my community talked about men who did not conform to what was expected of them, and none of those conversations had been kind. That voice was not someone else's voice, not really. It had become my own voice over the years, and that was perhaps the most exhausting and heartbreaking part of it all. The fact that I had learned to bully myself in the language of my own thoughts. There was a period in my second year of college when the weight of all of this became genuinely unbearable. I was carrying two selves everywhere I went, the one everyone could see, and the one I was slowly, secretly, terrifyingly beginning to understand. And the gap between them was widening in a way that was becoming physically painful, a pressure behind the sternum, a chronic low-level dread that did not go away when I woke up in the morning. I stopped sleeping well. I stopped eating regularly. My grades dropped and my professor called me in for a meeting and asked if everything was all right, and I said yes, everything was fine, and she looked at me with the expression of someone who does not quite believe you but is not going to push, and I went back to my room and sat on my bed for a very long time. It was around this time that I found the forum. I will not give it a name because it does not matter what it was called. What matters is what it was, a space online where people who were going through exactly what I was going through wrote about their experiences. Real people, not characters, not theories, just actual human beings describing the particular texture of what it felt like to carry a feminine identity inside a life that had been built around a different assumption. I read for hours. I read until the screen blurred. And then I closed my laptop and cried in a way I had not cried since I was a child, ugly and uncontrolled and completely private. Cried not from sadness exactly, but from the overwhelming and almost unbearable relief of recognition, of finding out that I was not, as I had always secretly feared, the only person in the world who felt this way. The following months were education in self-knowledge. Slow, non-linear, frequently painful, but real. I read everything I could find. I thought for a long time about the difference between cross-dressing as an act and gender identity as a state of being, and began to understand that for me these were not separate things, that the desire to present as feminine was not a costume or a performance but an expression of something internal that had been there since before I had words for it, since before that afternoon in my sister's room, since before memory itself. I thought about the word identity and what it actually meant, not just how you appear to others, but who you are when there is nobody watching. I thought about who I was when there was nobody watching. And for the first time, I let myself sit with the answer without immediately trying to push it down. There was one night, midway through my third year of college, that I think of as the night that changed everything. My roommate had gone home for a long weekend. I had the room to myself for 4 days. And on the first evening of that long weekend, I sat with myself and made a decision, not a dramatic decision, not an irrevocable one, just a quiet one. I was going to spend those 4 days not performing. Not for anyone else. Just for myself. I want to tell you what those 4 days were like, and I want to be honest with you about the full range of emotions involved, because I think it is important. There was joy. There was a kind of joy so specific and so clean that I had no reference point for it, because I had never felt it before. But there was also grief. Grief for all the years I had spent locked away from this part of myself. Grief for the boy everyone had been so sure they understood. Grief for the simplicity of a life in which I was not carrying all of this. There was fear. There was enormous, stomach-dropping fear about what this meant for my future, about what I was going to do with this knowledge now that I could not know it. And there was, underneath everything else, a tenderness toward myself that I had not felt in a very long time, maybe ever, a feeling of something like compassion for the version of myself that had been carrying this alone for so many years. On the last day of that long weekend, I stood in front of the small mirror above my desk for a very long time. I had spent parts of those 4 days exploring, carefully and privately, different ways of dressing, different ways of moving, different ways of existing in my own body, and I had learned things about myself that no class and no conversation had ever taught me. And standing there on that last day, I looked at myself with something approaching clarity. Not perfect clarity, not the clarity of having all the answers, but the beginning of clarity, the first thin light of it, enough to see by. I thought about what came next. About whether I could tell anyone. About who might understand and who would not. About the particular calculus of trust that governs all of our most important confidences. I thought about my sister, who had been, without knowing it, a kind of unwitting guide through the years. I thought about a friend I had made in college, someone who had mentioned once, very casually, that one of their cousins was gender non-conforming, and they had said it with such matter-of-fact acceptance that I had stored the memory of it like a coin I might need later. The journey after that is one I am still on. I want to be honest about that too, because stories have a tendency to resolve in ways that real life does not always honor. I am still learning. I am still, in many contexts, navigating the complexity of who I am and how much of that I share with any given person in any given situation. I have not made any grand announcements. I have not transformed in front of the world in some cinematic moment of revelation. What I have done is something quieter and more durable. I have started telling the truth to myself. And I have, very slowly and very carefully, begun telling it to a few other people too. I told my friend first, the one who had mentioned their cousin with such casual grace. We were sitting in the college canteen on an ordinary afternoon, and I heard myself starting to speak before I had fully decided to, and the words came out in a rush, unpolished and incomplete and full of the particular terror of saying something out loud that you have only ever said inside your own head. And my friend listened. They listened completely. And when I finished they said, "Okay," and then after a pause they said, "Thank you for telling me," and those 5 words were so sufficient, so exactly what I needed, that I had to look away for a moment to collect myself. There is something I want to say about the experience of being heard, genuinely heard, which is that it changes the landscape of whatever you are carrying. It does not make it lighter, exactly, it does not solve anything or resolve anything, but it changes the texture of it because it is no longer only yours. When another person receives something true about you and does not flinch, does not recalibrate their understanding of you in a way that makes the air between you go cold, when they simply receive it and continue to be present with you, something fundamental shifts. The isolation lifts. Not completely, not all at once, but enough. Enough to breathe. I told my sister months later, and that is a story of its own, one that I will tell you honestly, it was harder. Not because she responded badly, she did not respond badly at all. She sat with it and asked me careful questions and was in the end more compassionate than I had dared to hope. But it was harder because she was family, because she was connected to all the years of the performance, because she had known the version of me that had been carefully keeping all of this from view, and talking to her meant acknowledging how much had been hidden for how long. There was a moment in that conversation where she said, "I wish you had felt like you could tell me sooner," and I did not know what to say to that because the answer was so complicated and so wrapped up in fear and shame and the particular way that love can make people harder to be honest with rather than easier, because the stakes are higher, because losing the love of someone you love in return is a loss of a different order entirely. I have not told my parents. I am not ready to tell my parents. I want to say that plainly and without apology because I think there is a tendency in stories like this one to treat the parent revelation as the inevitable climax, the moment that proves everything has been resolved, and I do not want to participate in that particular narrative pressure. My parents are people I love enormously and who love me enormously, and we are all, in our various ways, products of our time and our context and our community, and I do not yet know what shape that conversation will take or when it will happen or whether the version of it that happens will be the one I imagine or something completely different. What I know is that it will happen eventually. And I am, very slowly, preparing myself for it. But here is what I have learned from all of it. Here is the thing I want to say most directly to whoever is watching this, whoever is sitting in their room somewhere feeling what I felt for all those years, feeling like there is a version of themselves that cannot be allowed to exist, like the truest part of them is the part that must be kept most hidden. The exploration does not destroy you. I know that seems obvious, I know it sounds like something someone would needlepoint onto a pillow, but I say it because I spent years terrified that if I allowed myself to actually look at this part of myself, to give it any space at all, it would unmake everything I had built. It would destroy my relationships, my future, my sense of who I was. And the opposite turned out to be true. The exploration did not unmake me. It made me more myself than I had ever been. All those years of suppression had taken a toll I had not even fully recognized until the weight of it began to lift, slowly and incompletely but genuinely, and I started to understand what it felt like to exist in my own life without constantly performing someone else's version of it. There are things I still do not know. There are questions I am still sitting with, about identity and expression and what I want my life to look like going forward and what I am able to build within the particular circumstances of the world I inhabit. These are not small questions and they do not have neat answers. But I have learned something about sitting with questions, about how they do not have to be answered immediately to be worth holding, about how the willingness to remain in uncertainty is itself a kind of courage, maybe the most available kind, the kind that does not require an audience or a climax or a perfect moment of resolution. The green glass bangles are still with me. I keep them in a small cloth pouch in the bottom of a bag. I have not worn them in a public way. But sometimes, when I am alone, when the room is quiet and the day has asked a lot of me in the way that days do, I take them out and put them on and I sit for a while with the person in the mirror. The person who is still, always, in the process of becoming someone more true. And I do not have to say anything to that person. I do not have to explain anything or justify anything or apologize for anything. I just look. And what I see, more often than not, is someone finding their way, imperfectly and honestly, toward a life that fits. That is the story I wanted to tell you. Not a finished story, because finished stories are for people whose lives are over, and mine is not over. It is in fact, in all the most important ways, just beginning. But a true story, as true as I know how to make it, which is all any of us can offer each other, in the end. The true account of what it cost us and what it gave us and what we are still in the middle of figuring out. If you are where I was, if you are in the years of suppression or the years of terrified exploration or the first raw moments of telling someone the truth, I want you to know that I see you. Not because I know exactly what you are going through, because I do not, because every version of this story belongs entirely to the person living it. But because the feeling of having something inside you that you have been told to hide is one of the most isolating experiences available to a human being, and I refuse to let you be as alone in it as I was, not if there is anything I can do about it. Which is this. Which is the telling of it. Which is maybe, in the end, the only thing any of us can do. Tell the truth about our own small corner of experience and trust that somewhere, it lands where it needs to. I am still learning how to live as the fullest version of myself. I suspect I will be learning for a long time. But I have stopped being afraid of the learning. And that, more than any single moment of revelation, more than any conversation or any afternoon alone in a room with a mirror, is the transformation I was always moving toward without knowing it. The shift from fear to curiosity, from hiding to wondering, from performance to the terrifying and beautiful practice of just being, imperfectly and honestly and with as much grace as I can manage, exactly who I am.